You can follow him at The Real Mike KB on Twitter. You've heard him here a lot on 97.3. NBA writer for CBS Sports, Sixers insider, Michael Kaskey-Blomain joins us now. Mike, how you doing on this Saturday?
I'm doing all right, Josh. Thanks for having me on the show.
I appreciate you jumping on. So we got a lot to get into, and I wanted to start with the Sixers because obviously since the last time you and I talked, we haven't had a lot of chance to talk about Marc Eversley. Eversley was the guy in the Sixers front office. He is now the GM over in Chicago. And I want to know your perspective on this because of the fact that, you know, when Elton Brand was hired, you know, the impression put out there was that, you know, whoever the new GM was going to be after Colangelo, they wanted to keep a lot of the people who were already in the front office there. And one of those people was specifically Marc Eversley, a guy who's well-respected around the league, and that his reputation has now led him to be the GM of the Bulls. So I want to get your impression of Eversley becoming now one of the main men in Chicago and what that means impact-wise for the Sixers front office.
Yeah, that's a great question, Josh. Obviously, like you said, Marc had been a guy that was under Colangelo. He actually worked with Brian Colangelo when he was in Toronto with the Raptors. He moved around the league a little bit and came back under Colangelo's staff when he joined the Sixers a couple of years ago, and obviously remained, once Colangelo was replaced with Elton Brand, like you said. He's played a pretty big role in things that the Sixers have done over the past several seasons. Obviously he, I'm sure, had a pretty big role in the signings this past offseason in terms of Tobias and Al Horford and, pretty much everything that's happened in the past couple of years in terms of the team building. So it is going to leave a hole in Philadelphia. Obviously, he wasn't the main decision maker here, so it's not going to be, a huge difference right off top, but it is a situation where this is a guy that was, he had Elton Brand's ear. Obviously, Elton listened to him. Like you said, he's a pretty well-respected guy throughout the NBA. So, it'll be interesting to see how he's able to do in Chicago because we don't know, how he would do as the sole GM of a franchise. Obviously, he wasn't that in Philly. It's a good opportunity for him. And I think in the long run, it won't be a huge loss for the Sixers, but I do think it's a role that they're going to have to fill, with somebody else now that he's gone.
Now, on a micro level, we know that The Athletic is reporting that current Sixers assistant Ime Udoka, who was a guy from the Spurs, was one of the top assistants in San Antonio, now in Philadelphia. Well, he might be a candidate to replace Jim Boylan in Chicago now that Eversley has left Philadelphia to go to Chicago. So is there another domino effect that could come if Udoka leaves Philadelphia and goes and joins Eversley in Chicago?
Yeah, I think there definitely is, Josh, and I think that's a situation that's very likely. I know, obviously, working together, Udoka and Eversley formed a bond here in Philly. I don't know how, obviously, Eversley feels about Jim Boylan in Chicago. There's certainly been reports coming out of Chicago. He's not the most well-liked guy, amongst the players on the team and everything like that, but he does have some support in the front office. So the first decision, obviously, they have to make is if they're going to stick with Boylan for another season and give him a little more leeway to try to turn the Bulls back into a contender. He obviously replaced Fred Hoiberg less than, just like 2 years ago when Hoiberg was replaced by the Bulls front office. So I think at the end of the day, that's the first decision. And then if they do decide to go in a different way, I think Udoka could be, top of the list for Chicago. He's a guy that has kind of been waiting his time to get a head coaching opportunity. He was a guy that's been mentioned in a couple other spots. So if they do decide to go in a different direction, I could see him being the top of the list. And if that's the case, again, Brett Brown is going to be forced to, juggle around his assistant coaches. Obviously, he lost Lloyd Pierce to Atlanta a couple years ago, who was a lead assistant. Had to do some shuffling since then. So it's another situation where if, Udoka does leave, he's one of the main assistants. He sits right next to Brett. So there'll be, some shuffling going on. But for the time being, it's kind of a holding pattern, obviously, with the league, and then to see what the decision the Bulls are going to make in regards to their head coach.
Now, you mentioned about Brett Brown's staff, and that leads me to my next thought, which is Udoka leaves, Pierce leaves. We know Billy Lang left for the coaching college. Mike D'Antoni was here for a hot minute on the coaching staff. It seems like there's been a revolving cast of people who have been on that bench for Brett Brown. What is the impact of that revolving cast of people on Brown and the Sixers and the system and the culture that they've had in Philadelphia? Could another change of that coaching staff, listen, it's great for the coaches to get new jobs and, advance their careers, but what is the impact on Brett and the Sixers left behind?
Yeah, that's a great point, Josh, and it's pretty tough. And usually this, when a team has its assistant coaches and consistently poached, like you just alluded to, obviously Mike D'Antoni has gone on to win Coach of the Year since he was on the sideline here. And that's usually the sign of a successful franchise, and obviously a head coach that has, built the culture and brought up assistants underneath him that, people around the league feel they have the potential and ability to be a good head coach themselves, which, obviously you saw this in the Popovich tree in San Antonio, which Brett Brown comes from. He's had multiple assistants over time, and good organizations are able to, kind of bounce back from that and find someone else, identify another person to kind of bring up into the chain. But it's definitely a difficult thing to lose someone that's that, important to the game planning that they do for the organization. And with so much turnover that the Sixers have already been dealing with, it's just going to be another notch, I guess, of something that they kind of have to overcome in terms of not stability and, different faces popping up. But they have other guys that have been around. Obviously, Jim O'Brien has been on the bench for a while, Kevin Young, John Bryant. I mean, they have assistant coaches that are familiar, obviously, with the organization and the franchise. So losing one's not the end of the world. But again, it's a situation where, it's a guy that's been around the team, familiar with it, and then to have him go somewhere else is kind of just another bump in the road, I guess you could say, for the Sixers.
Michael Kaskey-Blomain joining us on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline on 97.3 ESPN, CBS Sports. Follow him on Twitter at @TheRealMikeKB. Mike, let's flip it over to the NBA because obviously, there's been a lot of talk in the last 72 hours about the league trying to get back on their feet. It obviously started with the report by Shams Charania the other day about, did the NBA seriously considering the Walt Disney plan that was written about by Keith Smith at Yahoo Sports. Last night, apparently the MGM is pushing in Las Vegas very hard for their property to be used for a bubble scenario. LeBron James, the best player on the planet, is saying we need to play. We know the league is basically officially pushed back the draft combine. They're talking about restarting next season in December if they can get the season for this year, this summer. It seems like a lot of dominoes are falling into place for the league to come back. So if the league is able to come back this summer, what can we really expect when we get these guys back out there?
Yeah, that's a great question, Josh. And I think the first thing that you would expect, obviously, is some rust. Players, even during an off season or something like this, they still have the ability to get into the gym, to, work out with each other, to play pickup games, things like that. And that's something, obviously, that they haven't been able to do now for, almost 2 months. And it's an unparalleled situation for a lot of these guys. There's been, several players have come out and said that they don't even have access to a hoop or to a gym. And some guys haven't shot for over a month. So I think the first thing you have to take into account is that it's not like, even if they get to clear all the hurdles from the, health officials and the WHO and everything like that, even if there's a plan put in place where, say they go to Vegas or go to Orlando and Disney World, they still have to have, probably 3 weeks to a month of buffer time, whether that would be finishing out the rest of the regular season or, having some exhibitions or something to get the players back into, a shape where they could play at high level playoff basketball. Because, regular season basketball is one thing, but then the intensity that comes with playoff basketball is a whole nother step. And that takes, the entire, especially at this point in the NBA, players almost use the regular season, the 6 months of that, as a warm up to make sure that they're in peak shape for that playoff run. So to have this break right now, I think it's really difficult for a lot of these guys. So, and I think the main thing would be, Chris Paul had a conference call with media members the other day. Chris Paul is the president of the Players Association. He basically said that there's some concern, amongst the players about potentially getting rushed back out there in terms of, making the TV money for the league or something like that. And there's concern that, if they rush too much, there's going to be some injuries that last longer than this season, and they're concerned about that. So if they do return, they want to make sure that there's more than enough time for them to get back into the groove of things. So that's, something that has to be considered, pretty intensely, on top of just the fact of when and if they would even be able to logistically figure out a plan to play.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things, Mike, and you tell me what you think of this, I think there's two factors that are going to lead to the league returning this summer. And again, I have no special insight, but if you read the stuff that guys like Woj and Windhorst and Shams and all the different guys are reporting out there, and then you combine it with the fact that the players in the league have billions of dollars on the line to lose if they can't resume. And, we all the medical experts are telling us, look, life as we know it is different. So we may just have to live differently, and the league may have to function differently till further notice. And part of that functionality may be making sacrifices. And to me, if you go by, Bobby Marks and Brian Windhorst's layout for how a return would look like with a 2 to 3 week training camp and then resuming the regular season and then playing a playoff and basically finishing the season, what would be basically September, it may look different and it may be different, but at the end of the day, they have a lot more to lose if they don't try to come back, arguably, than if they do come back in some people's eyes.
Yeah, absolutely, Josh. I totally agree with you. And I think that's why you're seeing the league and Adam Silver working so hard to try to figure out a logistical plan where it would work rather than, kind of just punting on the season and gearing up to hopefully be able to start the season on time next year. There's a report that just came out that you mentioned from Woj 2 days ago, I believe, that said that there's momentum for the next season to start back in December, regardless of what happens with this season. And also the fact that, the draft lottery in Chicago was postponed. I think that's a sign that shows, they're obviously the lottery can't be set until the seedings are completely locked in. And that's not the case yet because they are still trying to get the season done. So I think ultimately, obviously, like you said, the players, it's going to be different for the players. LeBron at first said he would never want to play a game without fans in the arena when the situation first appeared. And now, obviously, he's softened his stance. And while no player, no one would choose to play in empty arenas, that's, looking to be more and more like it's going to be the reality, at least, to start things off when, NASCAR is coming back without fans, the PGA Tour is coming back without fans. If the NBA is going to be the league that gets back in action, it's going to have to be either, without fans or in, obviously not in the packed arenas that they're used to playing, which is tough. But like you said, at the end of the day, it's a situation where it's going to be, they're going to have to settle. But most important for them is, finishing the season, crowning a champion. It would be really weird to look back in the history books and just have a blank, Toronto Raptors 2019 champions and then blank 2020 no champion. I think that's last case scenario. So even if it's not an ideal situation, they want to get it done. And financially, like you said, even if they're not getting the ticket revenue money, to have some sort of tournament where, it's on TV and all the teams are there and it's the main attraction throughout the summer, that would still, really help the BRI for the league going into next season. So, until it becomes, really feasibly, physically and feasibly impossible for them to do it, I think they're going to continue to, look down every avenue and try to figure out a way to finish this season, one way or another.
Mike, I'm curious about something else, and obviously we'll get to some more fun stuff. We'll talk about the Jordan documentary, but one more question about this. I've seen it mentioned online. Our listeners have texted this in 97.3 ESPN. I've heard this mentioned before that, we're living in a world right now where the person who works at ShopRite or Walmart can go to the store and work, and that people in different parts of the country are still able to do their jobs and go to work and they're okay. And, in the environment that we're in, what makes the NBA or any of these sports exempt from that? They're people too. Shouldn't they go to work as well? What do you say to that sentiment that people look at these players and say, look, if other people are able to go to work and function and live, why can't we do the same thing with sports?
That's a good point, Josh. I would think, the first thing that comes to my mind, at least specifically with basketball, is, the people that are, fortunate enough to still be able to work in society. There's obviously tons of measures in place. I went to the grocery store yesterday. You're not allowed to get within 6 feet of the cashiers. There's glass, between them. And they have this distance built in. And with basketball, especially compared to any other sport, it's just not physically possible to, avoid people in that regard. You're literally on top of each other. You're sweating on top of each other. That's part of the draw of the game, the proximity to it. And unless, there's a way that the league can really guarantee, that all these players are clean and, healthy and whatnot before they kind of get into this situation, it's still dangerous in terms of that the thing it could easily be spread amongst the players. and amongst, team staff and other people that come in close contact with them. I think that's the biggest concern, obviously, that they don't have, precautions put into place that they could do it. I think obviously the league is trying to come up with the bubble idea, which would require, I think Woj said in a report that it would be about 15,000 coronavirus tests would be needed, and then the players would have to be, basically isolated from their families for an extended amount of time, which is, that's not something that's being asked of the, the regular people that you're mentioning, the people that are able to go to work and they're able to, return to their family. In the NBA, you're asking these guys to, basically bubble themselves off for a couple months in a location without their friends and family on, and, strictly to work. Which is, given the money that they make, it's understandable that people would like to see it out there and would like to see some entertainment. But it just, to me, it's just kind of comparing apples and oranges until there's, precautions put in the players and the proximity that they have. And it's just not, it's not there at this point.
All right, but let's transition. You mentioned entertainment, something that's a little bit more, fun and enjoyable. This Jordan documentary has been incredible. And, The Last Dance on ESPN tomorrow night is episodes 5 and 6. I talked with Ben Golliver for the Washington Post yesterday. He said that tomorrow night, apparently it's going to have some of that Jordan gambling Atlantic City action in it. So I know locally we're all looking forward to seeing some of that. But also, I want to know from you, first of all, what has been, your biggest, positive, negative, whatever your takeaway from this Jordan documentary? Because you and I are close in age. So, we were not full-grown adults when Jordan was doing what he was doing. But we saw his career and his rise and his evolution and his dominance. But obviously we saw it through some younger eyes, whereas we're looking at it now, older, and seeing it maybe a little differently. So what are some of your takeaways so far from the first 4 episodes?
Yeah, that's a great point, Josh. Like you said, my first real memories of the Jordan is the second three-peat, starting in like 96, 97. I remember those series against the Jazz and the Sonics. But before that, it was, stuff just seeing highlights and replays and reading about it. So it's been, really interesting to get to see that, the perspective of, from Jordan's perspective of the way his career panned out, and to kind of get some of the behind the scenes footage. And I think to me, the thing that's really stuck out the most is I don't think I ever realized quite how much, dysfunction, if you want to use that word, was kind of going on behind the scenes in Chicago. And the fact that they were able to have so much success during the 90s, despite the fact that, the best player on the team basically hated the general manager. The second best player on the team hated the general manager. The coach didn't get along with the general manager. There was pressure from ownership. There was just so many different factors going on behind the scenes there, and that's usually the sign of a team that's not going to be great, when there's a lot of internal strife and struggle going on within the locker room. That's usually tough to translate to, a good team on the court, let alone a team that wins 6 titles in 8 years. So I think for me, to the point that you made, for someone that, didn't see Jordan's career in its entirety from when he was drafted to 83, I think it was just been pretty eye-opening to see, just how much drama was going on behind the scenes of the Bulls during the whole time when they were having so much success on the court. I didn't realize that Jordan's beef with Jerry Krause stemmed all the way back to his second season, when he broke his foot and, he wanted to play, and the Bulls were almost pulling a pre-process thing where they were trying to limit his minutes so that they could kind of tank for a draft pick. And there was some tension there. And then that was carried on for over a decade. So to me, it's just, seeing the behind the scenes footage that, has never been seen publicly before, and getting some of this information that, it may have been reported at the time, to see it kind of laid out in the chronological manner that it's been. This documentary has been, obviously super, super interesting and eye-opening. And like you said, it couldn't have come at a better time, obviously, with no other sports going on right now. It's almost like, these are being treated almost like games where it seems like everyone, is watching it every Sunday night. Twitter's going nuts about it. It's being reported on like it's live events instead of stuff that happened 20 years ago. So, it's definitely a nice, good timing and a break and some entertainment during this tough time when there's no other sports to turn to.
Yeah, and you mentioned the dysfunction, and I feel like that's one of the biggest things that I hope people take away from this, because let's be realistic. If the Jordan Bulls function in today's world, Twitter and social media would be losing their doggone mind. Like, hashtag NBA Twitter would blow up Twitter almost every night because of some of this stuff that was going on. And, I look at the dysfunction, and I look at Phil Jackson's relationships, and I look at the whole dynamic of Scottie not even being a top 100 paid player by the time his time was done in Chicago. And, I'm currently reading the Jordan book by David Haberstrom. playing for keeps, kind of like a companion piece with the documentary. And like, I feel like now looking back at it, I feel like as much as things have changed in the league, not much really has, Mike, because of the fact that players are still dysfunctional, and there's dysfunction between front offices and coaches, and people taking credit and people being jealous and people having all these issues. And it almost makes me appreciate Jordan more because I look around, I'm like, man, the league's always been a bit of a mess.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point, Josh. And I do agree. I think the league is almost the same. The thing that's changed is the way it's covered and the news cycle. And like you said, NBA Twitter, it's, if the Bulls had existed in this time where there was that Twitter, you don't even know if they would have went on to win 6 titles just because of the, the blowback. Some of these stories would have been leaked. Obviously, some of the behind the scenes dealings would come out. The way things are with Scottie have held out. There's, with Jordan and Krause have been able to coexist for over a decade in the same franchise when there's, clearly jealousy and bitterness going on between the two. It's just, a different time and age. Obviously, Dennis Rodman would have been, his off-court exploits today would be a legend. And back then they were obviously reported, but they weren't broken down and dissected to the same level that, something like, Jahlil Okafor when he was in Philly and he had a couple of off-court incidents. That was, all anyone was talking about for days, and that was, really minor stuff compared to some of the stuff that was happening with Rodman back in the day. So, I think this documentary has done a good job of showing that, the things that teams deal with today, like this, obviously the Sixers have had internal issues or other franchises. Those have always existed, but there just hasn't been quite the same microscope being held to that up until, the past decade or so, where the news cycle has really changed and Twitter and Instagram and social media and whatnot has given, fans, a whole different level of access to players. I think it's kind of forgotten that, how long it took Jordan to have success too. That's another thing that obviously I knew, but the documentary kind of highlights. I mean, Jordan was drafted in 83, and he didn't win his first title until the early 90s. So you're talking about, 7-8 years of him in Chicago getting to the playoffs, losing, in Philly today, the Sixers have been to the playoffs twice, got to the second round, and people are already calling for, trade Embiid, trade Ben Simmons. Jordan had to wait 8 years in Chicago, and I'm sure there was some of those same calls at that. I mean, I know there were. People were saying that Jordan was, a great player, but he was an individual player. He wasn't, the way he played wasn't conducive to team success. He was, selfish. He was this and that. And obviously that narrative has completely shifted, not now following the 6 titles. But it's just interesting at that time, there probably would have been, if Twitter existed, there would have been a ton of people saying, the Bulls will never win with Jordan. Jordan needs to be traded, this and that. And that's just, the difference today that wasn't there then, whereas today, if you have 2 seasons where you don't get to a championship, people are saying you should trade your best player.
I think one other takeaway I have from the Jordan documentary, and this is something I kind of have always felt, but I've always gotten pushback from people about, I don't think people today fully appreciate how athletic guys like Jordan and Pippen and Isaiah Thomas, some of these other great players from the 80s and 90s were. These guys were not stiff beanpoles like we look at people from the 60s and 70s in some ways. I mean, these were phenomenal jumpers and dunkers, and people have talked about how fast Jordan. People don't realize how fast Jordan was in his prime. Pippen was a phenomenal athlete. Isaiah Thomas, I mean, he's still one of the fastest players to ever play the game. So we're talking about guys who were phenomenal athletes, and sometimes I feel overlooked because we see so much of the LeBrons and Durants and these guys today. But I think one of the things that gets overlooked is that era of basketball had their own set of great athletes. And I feel like that allows us to maybe look when we have these talks about who's better, who's greater, whose dominance was run. And maybe we can start dismissing, Mike, about the fact of, well, guys today are just so much more athletic. Well, I'm going to assume that if you put Jordan's Bulls in today's era and they had the same access to facilities and everything today, that they would be elite as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Josh. I think that it's like a misconception a lot of times that people kind of write off, pre-mid-90s or 2000s basketball as being unathletic. I think it's fair to say that in general, like the average NBA player is more athletic, because there was some guys during the 80s and early 90s that weren't, as athletic as some of the players today. But when you're talking about the cream of the crop, the guys like Jordan or Pippen or Isaiah Thomas that you just named, you could drop them in any era. If you put them in, like you said, in today's basketball with guys like LeBron and Durant, their athleticism would hold up, no doubt. They would be able to, do all the same things. And exactly like you said, too, with the advancements in just in the bit like the things that players can do to work out and get themselves prepared today, and the technology that's kind of tied to that. If you put these guys into those atmospheres, they would absolutely hold up. And I do think that that's, kind of not a fair part of the argument when people, talk about athleticism. As a whole, yes, I would say that it's fair to say that the players in the NBA today are probably more athletic, but the guys that, stood out so much during their playing days stood out for a reason, that they had this athleticism that would translate to any era, and especially the two guys on the Bulls that you just mentioned. I mean, Michael Jordan was the prototype. He was the Kobe Bryant before Kobe Bryant. I think the argument, anyone would say that Kobe is one of the most athletic players that we've seen, in recent memory. And Scottie was kind of like the prototype hybrid of guys that are, really popular to have in team building in the NBA today. Those forwards that can guard multiple positions, that can get out and transition, dunk, shoot. I mean, he could do everything on the basketball court, and that's the exact type of kind of Swiss Army knife piece, almost like an Andre Iguodala, but a better version with all the things he could do. So I definitely agree with you that, the athleticism in the 90s was, maybe not overall as good, but these guys were as athletic as anyone in the league today.
He is Michael Kaskey-Blomain. Follow him on Twitter at @TheRealMikeKB on Twitter. CBS Sports NBA writer, Sixers insider, and as all guests, he appeared here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. And Mike, early happy birthday to you, okay?
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate it, man.
All right, I'll catch you on the other side, man. Take care of yourself.
All right, man. Thanks for having me on.